The vicious humidity of a Charlotte summer clung to Sarah's skin like a second shirt, a damp and oppressive welcome home. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt of the I-485 loop, turning her daily commute into a grueling test of patience and air conditioning. As she navigated her Honda through the swarming traffic, the roar of engines and the endless river of brake lights seemed to fade into a dull hum in the back of her mind. She was already picturing it, the cool rush of air as she opened her front door, the satisfying click of her heels on the hardwood floors, and the deep blissful silence of her own private sanctuary. As the manager of a massive logistics warehouse near the airport, Sarah's days were a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shipping manifests, and the constant pressure of deadlines. The holiday season was creeping closer, and the stress was already mounting, a familiar knot tightening in her shoulders. Today had been particularly brutal. A lost shipment, a forklift breakdown, and an hour spent calming down an irate client. All she wanted was to soak in a hot bath until her fingers turned to raisins and forget the world existed. Finally, she turned onto her street, a quiet tree-lined lane in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was the one part of her life that felt entirely unequivocally hers. 2 years before she'd even met her husband, Kevin, she had bought this charming 2-story house. The down payment came from a modest inheritance her grandmother had left her. The proceeds from selling a small plot of land nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the rest was funded by years of disciplined saving of packing her own lunch and driving older cars while her friends took lavish vacations. Holding the deed with only her name Sarah Clark printed on, it was one of the proudest moments of her life. When she married Kevin, a decent but unambitious electrician whose salary barely covered his own expenses, he had moved in with little more than a beat-up pickup truck and a toolbox. Sarah never cared. She believed a marriage was a partnership built on love and shared dreams, not financial statements. A faint smile touched her lips as her house came into view, its cheerful blue siding and the climbing roses she'd painstakingly planted around the porch, a welcome sight. But as she pulled into the driveway, the smile evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling sense of confusion. Something was terribly wrong. She stared at her front gate, a sturdy iron structure she'd had installed for privacy. Her smart lock, the sleek black keypad and fingerprint scanner she'd spent a small fortune on just 2 months ago for convenience, was gone. In its place were ugly, gaping holes torn into the metal frame. The paint chipped away to reveal raw, mangled steel. Woven through the gate's bars was a thick, rusty chain held together by a cheap, oversized brass padlock that looked like something you'd find on a storage locker. Sarah froze, her hand still on the car door handle. She blinked, wondering if the exhaustion was making her see things. She looked at the house number, 5812, gleaming in the afternoon sun. She looked at the mailbox she'd painted herself. This was her home. Who would do this? Why? Her first instinct was to call Kevin. The phone rang and rang, echoing in the unsettling quiet of her car before finally going to voicemail. She tried again and again. Nothing but the same hollow, unanswered ringing. A knot of anxiety began to twist in her stomach, sharp and acidic. Through the gaps in the iron gate she could see a bright white scooter, a model she'd never seen before, parked brazenly on the walkway, a pink helmet dangling from its handlebars. Then she heard it. Laughter. It wasn't Kevin's quiet chuckle. It was a loud booming laugh that carried through the closed front door. A sound she knew all too well. It was the unmistakable sound of her mother-in-law Helen. The laugh was followed by a younger woman's voice, sweet and sticky like cheap syrup. "Oh, you're too good to me, Helen. You think of everything." "Nonsense, dear," Helen's voice boomed back. "Anything for my grandbaby. He needs peace and quiet to grow strong." Sarah's blood ran cold. Grandbaby. She stumbled out of her car, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Tyler, Kevin's younger, perpetually unemployed brother, had a new girlfriend but a baby? And what were they doing here? Why was her lock destroyed? Her heart hammering against her ribs, she marched to the gate and pressed the doorbell, holding the button down until the electronic chime shrieked without end. Inside, the laughter stopped abruptly. A moment later, Helen's stout silhouette appeared behind the frosted glass of the front door. She was wearing one of Sarah's silk house robes. She moved with an infuriating slowness, not with the surprise of an unexpected guest, but with the deliberate, arrogant pace of a new queen surveying her domain. Helen didn't open the gate. She walked right up to it, peering at Sarah through the bars with a look of cold, triumphant disdain. "You're back," she said, not as a question but as a flat statement. "Helen, what is going on?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why is my lock broken? Where's Kevin? Let me in." Helen let out a short, humorless laugh, picking at a piece of apple stuck in her teeth. "Oh, that old thing. It was too complicated. I had a man come and take it out. This is much simpler." She rattled the rusty chain for emphasis. "As for letting you in, well, there's been a change of plans." "A change of plans?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "This is my house. What are you talking about?" "This house is for family," Helen declared, her eyes narrowing. "And right now, the most important family member is my unborn grandchild. Tyler's girlfriend, Amber, is pregnant. The doctor said she needs a calm, spacious environment. Her little apartment is just too cramped and noisy, so I decided they'll live here." Sarah stared, speechless. The sheer audacity of the woman was like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "You decided? This is my house. I bought it with my money. You have no right." "I am your husband's mother," Helen cut in, her voice dripping with venom. "You married my son, so what's yours belongs to this family. You've been married 3 years and your womb is still empty. It's time to make way for someone who can actually do her duty and provide an heir. Your master bedroom is the biggest and gets the best light, so I've already moved them in." A wave of nausea washed over Sarah. Her bedroom, her private space, filled with her personal belongings, her life, invaded and occupied by strangers. "You are out of your mind," Sarah whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Get them out of my house now." Helen simply smiled, a cruel, thin-lipped expression. "I don't think so. In fact, it's probably best if you find somewhere else to stay for a while. Go back to your father's little shack in the mountains. This house is a bit crowded now." As if on cue, the sky, which had been a brilliant blue just moments before, began to darken. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak trees and carrying the first heavy fat drops of rain. Sarah stood frozen, locked out of her own home as the storm began to break, mirroring the tempest that was just beginning to rage inside of her. The rain began to fall in earnest. Thick, heavy drops that splattered against the pavement and soaked through Sarah's thin blouse in seconds. The chill wasn't just from the water. It was a deep internal cold that came from a place of profound betrayal. She stood there drenched and shivering, staring at the woman who was not just stealing her home, but gleefully trying to shatter her spirit. Just then the front door opened again. Kevin stepped out onto the porch, looking sheepish and avoiding her eyes. He was still in his work clothes, a faded polo shirt and jeans, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his fingers. "Kevin!" Sarah's voice cracked with a desperate sliver of hope. "Kevin, tell me this is a joke. Tell your mother to open this gate right now." He flinched at her tone, taking a hesitant step forward, but stopping short of the gate, using his mother as a human shield. "Look, Sarah, just calm down," he mumbled, his eyes darting from his mother to the ground. "Mom's right. It's a complicated situation. Amber's pregnant. She's not feeling well." "Complicated?" Sarah's voice rose, laced with disbelief. "You're letting them throw me out of my own house, and you're telling me to calm down." "It's not forever," he said quickly, his voice a low whine. "It's just for a little while, until they get on their feet. You know how Mom is. Don't make a scene. We can't have her getting all worked up." The last flicker of hope in Sarah's chest died out, extinguished by his cowardice. He wasn't her partner. He wasn't her husband. He was just his mother's son, a spineless accomplice to the theft of her life. "My scene," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You think the problem here is me making a scene?" Helen, seeing her son waver, stepped forward with a smirk. "There you see, he agrees. A man's first duty is to his blood. Now, if you'll excuse us, we were in the middle of celebrating." She turned to go back inside, but then paused, a wicked gleam in her eye, as if she just remembered the final perfect touch to her cruel masterpiece. "Oh, I almost forgot," she said, turning back. She walked over to the corner of the porch where a large black industrial trash bag was slumped against the wall. With a grunt, she heaved it up and carried it to the gate. She struggled for a moment to shove its bulk through the bars before giving up and simply hurling it over the top. The bag landed with a sickening wet thud in a puddle at Sarah's feet. The flimsy plastic split open, spilling its contents onto the muddy asphalt. A half dozen of her favorite books, their pages now soaked and ruined. The worn-out college sweatshirt she loved to sleep in. A pair of running shoes. And on top of the pile, a small framed photo of her and her grandmother, the glass now cracked. That was it. That was the moment something inside Sarah snapped. The shock, the hurt, the overwhelming sense of loss, it all coalesced and hardened into something new. Something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. The shivering stopped. The tears that had been welling in her eyes receded, replaced by an icy clarity. They hadn't just taken her house. They had taken her kindness for weakness. They had taken her love for granted. And they had mistaken her for a doormat. They were about to learn how terribly wrong they were. Helen watched, expecting a storm of tears, a pathetic breakdown. Instead, Sarah slowly bent down, not to salvage her ruined belongings, but to pick up her smartphone, which had fallen from her numb fingers. Its screen was slick with rain, but it glowed with defiant light. She stood up straight, her back rigid, her expression unreadable. She turned her back on the gate, on her husband, on the life that had just been stolen from her, and walked calmly to the shelter of a neighbor's large oak tree. Her fingers moved with steady, deliberate precision. Her first call wasn't to a friend for comfort or to her father for help. It was to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. "Hello," she said, her voice completely level, devoid of any emotion. "I need to report an illegal entry and destruction of property at 5812 Maple Creek Lane. My name is Sarah Clark. I am the sole owner of the property. A group of individuals has forcibly removed my smart lock, illegally changed the locks, and are currently occupying my home. I am locked outside and they are refusing to leave. Yes, I am safe, but the situation is escalating. I request immediate assistance." She ended the call and without a moment's hesitation dialed a second number. This one was for David Chan, the razor-sharp head of the legal department at her company. "David, it's Sarah Clark. I apologize for calling after hours, but I have an urgent personal matter that requires your expertise," she said, her tone shifting into the professional, efficient voice she used at work. "I need your immediate advice on the fastest possible legal procedure for an emergency eviction of unauthorized occupants from a private residence. I have the deed, a premarital asset agreement, and video evidence from my security camera of the property damage. Yes, I'll email you the files right now. I need them out tonight." She hung up, the last word echoing in the rainy air. The rain continued to pour, washing the grime from the street and the tears from her face. But Sarah no longer felt the cold. A fire had been lit within her. A quiet, controlled inferno of pure resolve. They thought they had left her with nothing, but they had forgotten. She still had her mind, her courage, and the full unyielding power of the law on her side. In the distance, she heard the faint approaching wail of a siren. The fight for her home had just begun. It took less than 15 minutes for the cruiser to arrive, its blue and red lights painting silent, strobing patterns across the rain-slicked street. 2 officers from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department stepped out, their expressions a mixture of weariness and professionalism. Sarah met them at the end of her driveway, a waterproof document folder already in her hand. Her work as a logistics manager had taught her one thing. In any crisis, documentation is king. "I'm Sarah Clark," she said, her voice steady and clear, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside her. "I'm the owner of this property. Thank you for coming so quickly." The older officer, whose name tag read Davis, gave her a practiced, calming nod. "What seems to be the problem here, Miss Clark?" "My home has been illegally entered," Sarah stated, opening the folder. "My smart lock was destroyed and replaced with this chain. The individuals inside are my in-laws. They are occupying the property without my consent and are refusing to leave." She handed him the documents. "This is the deed to the house registered in my name only. This is my driver's license with the matching address. And this is a notarized premarital asset agreement, which specifies this property as my sole and separate asset purchased 2 years before my marriage." Officer Davis took the papers, his eyebrows raising slightly in surprise at her preparedness. He examined each document under the beam of his flashlight, his younger partner looking on. "This all seems to be in order," Davis said, handing them back. He then turned his gaze to the house. "All right, let's go have a word." He strode to the gate and hammered his fist against the iron bars, the sound ringing out with authority. "CMPD, open the gate. We need to have a talk." A moment later, Helen appeared at the door, her face a mask of feigned confusion and distress. "Oh, officers. Thank goodness. My daughter-in-law, she's not well. She's having some kind of breakdown. This is my son's home." "Ma'am, we've seen the deed," Officer Davis said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This property belongs to Miss Sarah Clark. She has requested that you and any other unauthorized individuals vacate the premises immediately." Helen's jaw dropped. The victim act evaporated, replaced by pure, unfiltered rage. "That's ridiculous. She's married to my son. What belongs to her belongs to him." "That's a civil matter for a divorce court, ma'am," the officer replied patiently. "Our job here is to deal with the present situation. The legal owner of this house wants you to leave. If you refuse, we will have to remove you for trespassing." Tyler and a very pouty Amber emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion. They stood behind Helen, looking utterly bewildered. The reality of the situation finally dawned on them. They weren't an occupying army, they were common trespassers. "You have 10 minutes to collect your personal belongings and leave," the officer commanded. The next 10 minutes were a blur of frantic activity and shouted curses. Helen, Tyler, and Amber scrambled to gather their things, their smug entitlement replaced with spitting fury. "You'll pay for this, you cold-hearted witch," Helen shrieked at Sarah, who stood watching silently from her driveway. "Mark my words, you will die miserable and alone." They piled their bags into a dented sedan parked down the street, a pathetic and undignified retreat. Tyler kick-started the scooter, Amber hopped on behind him, and they sped off into the rainy night without a backward glance. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. The police officers lingered just long enough to ensure they were truly gone. "You should get a locksmith out here tonight, Miss Clark," Officer Davis advised kindly before they departed. Sarah was already dialing. An hour later, a new industrial-strength deadbolt was being installed. Stepping back into her home felt strange. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The air was thick with the lingering scent of their cheap perfume and the greasy smell of takeout. Muddy footprints stained her favorite area rug and empty soda cans littered the coffee table. The sense of violation was a physical weight in the room. She didn't sleep, she cleaned. She scrubbed and disinfected every surface they might have touched, reclaiming her space inch by painful inch, erasing every trace of their presence until the sun began to rise. At 9 the next morning, the doorbell rang. It was Kevin. He stood on the porch holding a flimsy gas station bouquet of carnations, his face etched with forced remorse. "Sarah, baby, thank God." He began, trying to push his way inside. "We need to talk. Last night was a huge misunderstanding." She didn't move, blocking the doorway with her body. "No, Kevin. Last night was a moment of perfect clarity." "Come on, don't be like that," he pleaded. "Mom was just trying to look out for Tyler. You know how she is. She gets carried away. We can work this out." "Can we?" Sarah asked, her voice dangerously soft. She stepped back, but only to retrieve a stack of papers from the entryway table. "Let's talk about looking out for family, shall we?" She held up a printed bank statement. "This is from our joint savings account. We had $2,000 in it for emergencies. I see it was all withdrawn 3 days ago. What was the emergency, Kevin?" He stared at the paper, the color draining from his face. I had to get my truck repaired." "That's a good guess," Sarah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But this," she continued, holding up a second document, "is a printout of the registration for a brand new scooter purchased 3 days ago, paid in cash. And look at that, registered to an Amber Scott. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?" He was speechless, his lies exposed and useless. The last shred of his dignity crumbled. "I packed your things," Sarah said, her voice flat and final. "They're in the boxes by the garage door. Take them and get out of my house." "Sarah, please," he whispered. his eyes finally filling with the tears he should have shed for her the night before. "Don't," she commanded, cutting him off. "Just go. My lawyer will be sending the divorce papers to your mother's address. I assume that's where you'll be staying now." She closed the door on his stunned, tear-streaked face. Then she turned the deadbolt. The heavy metallic thud was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of the end of one life and the beginning of her own. Humiliation was a poison, and Helen was drowning in it. She, Tyler, and Amber had found a dingy two-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex on the other side of town. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp carpet and stale cigarette smoke. Peeling vinyl floors stuck to the soles of their shoes, and a persistent drip from the kitchen faucet provided a maddening, constant soundtrack to their disgrace. For Helen, who had briefly tasted life in Sarah's bright, clean home, this was an unbearable hell. Her fury, however, was not directed at her own greed or her son's uselessness, but squarely at the woman who had dared to stand up to her. "Sarah! She made us look like criminals," Helen seethed, pacing the small, grimy living room. "Calling the police on her own family. The nerve of that woman. Someone needs to teach her a lesson." Amber, who had been quietly scrolling through her phone, looked up, her expression a perfect blend of sympathy and cunning. She placed a gentle hand on Helen's arm. "You're right, Helen. It was a cruel, horrible thing to do. Especially to you after all you've done for this family." She paused, letting the flattery sink in. People should know the truth. They should know what kind of monster she really is. A dangerous idea began to form in Helen's mind, fanned into flame by Amber's sly encouragement. If Sarah wanted to play dirty, Helen would show her what real filth looked like. The next day, Helen put on her most sorrowful-looking dress and had Tyler drive her to the gleaming corporate park where Sarah worked. She waited until noon when the lobby and courtyard would be bustling with employees on their lunch break. As soon as she spotted Sarah walking toward the on-site cafe with a few colleagues, Helen launched her attack. She burst into tears, a theatrical, gut-wrenching wail that turned every head in the courtyard. "Sarah, my child, how could you?" she cried, stumbling forward dramatically. Sarah froze, her colleagues staring in confusion. Helen, now the star of her own one-act play, grabbed the arm of a bewildered-looking man in a suit. "Please, sir, you have to help me," she sobbed. "My daughter-in-law, she's a viper. She's having an affair with her boss, and when my son found out, she threw us all out on the street." "Me? An old woman?" "My other son and his pregnant fiancée. We have nothing. We're sleeping on the floor while she lives in luxury in the house my son helped pay for." The story was a masterpiece of fiction, each lie more venomous than the last. Whispers erupted around the courtyard. Colleagues who had respected Sarah 5 minutes ago were now looking at her with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and contempt. Sarah stood ramrod straight, her face pale, the container of salad in her hand suddenly feeling like a lead weight. To argue with a crying old woman in public would only make her look guiltier. She was trapped. Without a word, she turned and walked back into the building, the sound of Helen's sobs and the burn of 100 judgmental eyes following her. Back at her desk, Sarah's hands trembled, but her mind was a block of ice. She would not let them destroy her career, the one thing she had built for herself, with the same ease they had tried to destroy her home. She opened her email, her fingers flying across the keyboard. To HR Department. CC David Chen Legal. Subject: Harassment Incident and Formal Notification. Dear HR Team, this email is to formally document a public harassment incident that occurred today at approximately 12:15 p.m. in the main courtyard. I was accosted by my estranged mother-in-law Helen Miller, who made a series of false and defamatory statements about my personal life to my colleagues. This incident is related to an ongoing domestic dispute. For your reference and to provide clear context, I have attached a copy of the official police report from the night of October 25th detailing the illegal entry and trespassing at my private residence. I have taken legal steps to ensure this will not happen again on company property. Thank you for your understanding. She attached the PDF of the police report and hit send. It was a cold, corporate, and devastatingly effective counter-move. Meanwhile, back in the squalid apartment, Amber was preparing for Phase 2. The public smear was satisfying, but it didn't produce what she really needed: cash. "That was brilliant, Helen," she cooed, massaging the older woman's shoulders. But, slander isn't enough. We need to hit her where it really hurts in her wallet. What do you mean? Helen asked, still flushed from her performance. I was talking to a friend of mine. She knows a bit about the law, Amber lied smoothly. She said that even though the house is in Sarah's name, because Kevin lived there during the marriage and contributed to the household, he's legally entitled to half of its value in a divorce. It's called a marital asset. Helen's eyes widened, the familiar glint of greed returning. Half? The house is worth at least $500,000. Exactly, Amber said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. But to fight a woman like Sarah we need a shark, a really good lawyer. And that costs money up front. She paused, delivering the masterstroke. I heard your family has a small plot of land back in the mountains, unused, just sitting there. If you sold that, you could use the money to hire the best lawyer in Charlotte. Think of it as an investment. You spend $20,000 now to get $250,000 back. It's foolproof. The idea took root in Helen's mind and blossomed instantly. Revenge and a massive payday, it was irresistible. Selling off a piece of ancestral land, a place she hadn't visited in 30 years, seemed a small price to pay for the chance to utterly ruin Sarah and walk away rich. You're right, Helen said, her voice firm with newfound purpose. That ungrateful witch wants a war. Fine, we'll give her one she'll never forget. The relentless pressure of the city, the whispers at work, and the looming legal battle began to wear on Sarah's spirit. The walls of her own beautiful house started to feel like a fortress under siege. She needed to breathe, she needed to remember who she was before all of this. That Friday she packed an overnight bag, left a message for her lawyer, and drove west, letting the concrete jungle of Charlotte dissolve in her rear-view mirror. The winding roads of I-40 carried her up into the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the crisp autumn air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a pilgrimage back to her roots. Her hometown was a small, quiet place where time seemed to move a little slower. She spent the afternoon with her father, a retired woodworker with kind eyes and calloused hands, not talking about the specifics of her situation, but simply absorbing his quiet strength. The next morning, she drove to the next town over to visit Mr. Henderson, her father's best friend and a man who had known her since she was a little girl. They sat on his wide porch, drinking coffee and looking out at the kaleidoscope of red and gold leaves that painted the mountainside. After catching up, Sarah finally mentioned with a heavy sigh the name of the woman who was trying to ruin her life. It's Kevin's mother, Helen Miller, she said. She's just filled with so much hate for me, and I've never understood why. Mr. Henderson, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, set his mug down with a soft click. He stared out at the mountains for a long moment, a conflicted look on his face. Miller, you say? I remember a Helen from back in the day. A fiery girl, pretty but with a mean streak. Grew up just over the ridge from here. He paused. Sarah, what I'm about to tell you, it's old gossip. But seeing as what she's putting you through, you have a right to know. He leaned forward, his voice low. Long before your father ever met your mother, Helen had her sights set on him. She chased him something fierce. But your dad, he was a quiet man. He saw that bitterness in her even back then. He fell in love with your mother, a gentle, kind woman. When he married her, Helen was humiliated, and she was furious. She left town a few months later, swearing she'd never forget it. A wave of stunning clarity washed over Sarah, so powerful it almost took her breath away. It was like a key turning in a lock she never knew existed. The years of snide comments about her appearance, the backhanded compliments, the constant baseless criticism, it all made sense. So she knew who I was? Sarah whispered. When Kevin introduced us, she knew I was his daughter? Without a doubt, Mr. Henderson said grimly. And in her twisted mind, you're not just her son's wife. You're the daughter of the woman who got the life she thought she deserved. She's not fighting you, Sarah. She's fighting a ghost from 40 years ago. This revelation didn't bring Sarah anger, it brought her peace. It wasn't a failure on her part. It was a ghost she could never have defeated with kindness or effort. She wasn't dealing with a difficult mother-in-law, she was dealing with a woman consumed by a decades-old grudge. And that knowledge was a shield. 2 weeks later, Sarah walked into the airless conference room of a downtown mediation office. She was no longer a victim trying to defend her home, she was a woman armed with the truth. Helen and Kevin were already there, sitting beside a slick lawyer who looked like he'd rather be on a golf course. Helen wore a gaudy gold-colored blazer, trying to project an image of wealth and power. Their lawyers started laying out their claim with practiced ease. My clients are seeking 50% of the equity of the marital home valued at approximately $250,000 in light of Mr. Miller's significant financial and emotional contributions to the property during the marriage. Sarah's lawyer, David Chun, simply slid a copy of the deed and the pre-marital asset agreement across the table. The property is not and has never been a marital asset. It is the sole and separate property of Miss Clark. Helen, undeterred, launched into a tearful pre-rehearsed speech. But we gave them a gift, $10,000 in cash from my husband's retirement fund to help with the down payment. We have nothing to show for it. Sarah calmly pushed a second folder across the table. This is a certified bank statement showing the wire transfer for the full down payment, which came directly from an inheritance account established after the sale of my grandmother's property. The transfer occurred 4 months before our wedding. There were no large cash deposits of any kind. Kevin, seeing their main argument crumble, jumped in. But I paid bills. I did work around the house. My sweat equity has to count for something. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. David Chun cleared his throat. Since your client has brought up the subject of finances, Miss Clark has prepared a countersuit, which we are happy to file today should this mediation fail. He opened a third, much thicker folder. Here we have 3 years of bank records showing that 100% of the mortgage, utilities, insurance, and property taxes were paid from Miss Clark's personal account. We also have records showing that your salary, Mr. Miller, was deposited monthly into your mother's bank account, not a joint account. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, we have a signed and dated IOU from 2 years ago where Miss Clark loaned you, Mr. Miller, $7,000 to pay off your brother Tyler's gambling debts, a loan which has not been repaid. And finally, we have the transaction record for the $2,000 withdrawal from the joint savings account used to purchase a scooter for your brother's girlfriend. In total, David concluded, looking directly at a pale-faced Kevin, your contributions have left you with a debt to Miss Clark of $35,742. The room fell silent. Helen and Kevin stared at the mountain of evidence, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. Their lawyer shuffled his papers uselessly, his easy payday having just evaporated. Sarah stood up, her composure absolute. She hadn't raised her voice once she hadn't needed to. The truth, backed by indisputable proof, was a weapon far sharper than any insult. The hunter had just become the prey. The fallout from the mediation was swift and brutal. The in-laws world, built on a foundation of greed and lies, began to fracture under the weight of reality. The first cracks appeared with Tyler. The image of his mother's face, pale and slack-jawed in that sterile conference room, haunted him. The lawyer they'd paid for with precious family money had been rendered utterly useless. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced through Tyler's lazy indifference. He started watching Amber really watching her. He noticed how she clutched her phone, angling the screen away from him whenever a message came in. He saw how her stories about her past were vague and shifted with each telling. One afternoon, while Amber was taking one of her long, mysterious naps, his suspicion got the better of him. He rummaged through the purse she'd left on a chair. Tucked inside a side pocket, he found a folded piece of paper. It was the ultrasound report. He smoothed it out, his eyes scanning the technical jargon until they landed on the estimated due date. Then he saw it printed in clear black letters. Gestational age 14 weeks. Tyler wasn't a mathematician, but he could count. 14 weeks. That was 3 in 2 months. He and Amber had met on a dating app just over 2 months ago. Their first physical encounter, a drunken night after a concert, was exactly 9 weeks ago. The dates swam before his eyes. Cold, hard facts that refused to align. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a hot, sickening flush of shame. He wasn't going to be a father, he was going to be a fool. He waited until she woke up, the ultrasound picture trembling in his hand. Explain this, he said, his voice a low growl he didn't know he possessed. Amber's sleepy expression vanished, replaced by a flash of panic. What are you doing going through my things? 14 weeks, Amber, he repeated, shaking the paper. We've been together for 9. Make it make sense. She immediately launched into a flurry of excuses. The machine was old, the technician was new, her cycle was irregular. But the lies were clumsy and transparent. The conviction in her voice was gone. Seeing that he wasn't buying it, she switched tactics, bursting into tears. I can't believe you don't trust me. After everything I'm going through for this family, you're just as cruel as she is. But for the first time, her tears had no effect. He stared at her, not with anger, but with a dawning hollow horror. The cornerstone of their entire scheme was a lie. Meanwhile, Kevin's own world was unraveling with terrifying speed. The stress of the failed lawsuit and the crushing weight of the $35,000 countersuit gnawed at him. His mother's constant nagging phone calls about their financial ruin echoed in his head, a relentless chorus of failure. He went to his job as a senior electrician on a commercial construction site, but his mind was a million miles away. He was tasked with wiring the main server room for a new corporate headquarters, a delicate, high-stakes job. Distracted and sleep-deprived, he went through the motions. His mind replaying the mediation, Sarah's cold eyes, the smirking lawyer. In his haze, he made a rookie mistake, a fatal oversight. He forgot to isolate the main breaker before connecting the final high-voltage line. The moment the wires touched, the room erupted in a blinding flash of blue-white light and a deafening bang. A massive power surge ripped through the system. Kevin was thrown backward by the force, his ears ringing. The acrid smell of burning plastic and fried circuits filled the air. Every computer, every server, every piece of delicate, expensive equipment in that room was now a useless smoking brick. His supervisor was there in an instant, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "Miller, what have you done?" he screamed over the blaring fire alarm. "That's $100,000 worth of IT equipment. You could have killed someone." The consequences were immediate. Kevin was fired on the spot. The company's insurance would cover some of it, but their legal department made it clear they would be holding him personally liable for the deductible and any uncovered damages. He walked out of the construction site, a termination letter in one hand and a potential bill for $50,000 in the other. A zombie stumbling through the wreckage of his life. There was only one place to go. In his panic-stricken mind, there was only one person who had ever been able to fix his problems. He drove straight to Sarah's house. He pounded on her front door, his earlier fake remorse replaced with raw animal panic. When Sarah answered, her face was a calm, unreadable mask. "Sarah, thank God," he gasped, his words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. "You have to help me. I got fired. I made a mistake. A big one. They're going to sue me for thousands. I'll be ruined. You have to help me, please. Loan me. I'll pay you back. I swear." Sarah looked at the man she had once loved. A pathetic, broken creature standing on her doorstep, begging for a bailout from a disaster of his own making. There was no pity in her eyes, only a profound and weary finality. "No, Kevin," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "I will not. The money you owe me is from when you were my husband. The mess you're in now is entirely your own. You and your family wanted a war. These are your casualties." His desperation curdled into rage. The injustice in his warped view was too much to bear. "You cold-hearted bitch," he shrieked, his face contorting. "You did this. You put all this stress on me. This is your fault." He grabbed the bars of her new iron security door and began to shake it violently, the metal rattling in its frame. "You'll be sorry. I'll make you sorry." He spotted a decorative landscaping rock at the edge of her garden, his eyes wild. As he lunged for it, intending to smash her front window, a quiet click came from Sarah's hand. She was holding her phone, the 911 call already connected. The police arrived even faster this time. They found Kevin still raving, a rock in his hand, a man completely unhinged. They cuffed him for disorderly conduct and attempted destruction of property. As they led him to the cruiser, a sobbing, defeated wreck, Sarah watched from her doorway. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the grim, exhausting relief of a surgeon who has just excised a malignant tumor. The cancer was finally truly out of her life. Kevin was released the next morning, charged with misdemeanors and given a court date. He returned to the squalid apartment, a hollowed-out version of himself, the last of his blustering arrogance gone, replaced by a vacant, defeated stare. He collapsed onto a lumpy sofa and didn't move for the rest of the day. For Helen, her son's arrest was the final unbearable humiliation. Her grand plans had resulted in one son being fired and arrested, and the other discovering he was a cuckold. Her vendetta against Sarah had not brought victory, only ruin. But in her warped logic, the solution was not to retreat, but to escalate. She believed that if she could just apply enough pressure, Sarah's infuriating composure would crack and a flood of guilt and money would come pouring out. She huddled with Amber, the two of them whispering like witches over a cauldron. "We need to make her feel what she's done to us," Helen rasped, her eyes wild. "We need to make her see the pain she's caused this family." Amber, whose own creditors were now sending messages with a terrifying new urgency, saw an opportunity. "You're right, Helen," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sorrow. "She has no idea what it's like to be pushed to the absolute edge. We have to show her." And so they concocted their most desperate and pathetic scheme yet. Amber was dispatched to a nearby pharmacy where she purchased a large bottle of potent-looking chalky white tablets, generic multivitamins. Back at the apartment, Helen staged the scene. She scattered a few pills on the nightstand, lay down on the bed, and composed her face into a tragic mask of despair. Amber carefully coached Tyler on his lines. Tyler made the call, his voice cracking with rehearsed panic. Sarah, you have to come quick. It's Mom. She took a whole bottle of pills," he choked out. "She left a note. Said she couldn't live with the shame of what you did to us. She's not waking up. Please, you have to get here. You're the only one who can help." On the other end of the line, Sarah was sitting at her kitchen island reviewing quarterly reports. She listened to Tyler's frantic plea, her expression unchanging. A woman like Helen, who loved herself and her own drama more than anything in the world, would never actually harm herself. It was a play, a cheap, manipulative piece of theater designed to drag her back into their vortex of chaos. But she also knew that ignoring a potential suicide threat, even a fake one, was a risk she couldn't take. She would respond, but it would be on her terms. "Oh my God, Tyler, that's horrible," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of alarm. "Don't move her. What's the address of the apartment?" Tyler, believing the bait had been taken, rattled off the address. "Hurry, Sarah. She's getting cold. Bring money for the hospital." "I'll handle it right away," Sarah promised and hung up. But she didn't grab her car keys. She picked up her phone and dialed 3 numbers. 911. "I need an ambulance sent to 1482 Glenwood Drive, apartment 2B, she said, her voice calm and clear. "I've just been informed by a family member that a woman named Helen Miller has attempted suicide by taking an entire bottle of pills. He said she is unresponsive. Please send help immediately." Her next call was to the non-emergency line of the local police precinct. She repeated the story, adding, "The son who called me seemed extremely distraught. It might be a good idea to have an officer there to help manage the situation." Back at the apartment, Helen lay on the bed, trying to breathe shallowly while Amber fluttered around her, preparing for Sarah's arrival. Suddenly, instead of a knock at the door, the air was split by the deafening shriek of sirens growing rapidly closer. A fire truck, an ambulance, and a police cruiser screeched to a halt outside their building. "What's going on?"
Helen hissed, sitting bolt upright.
"I don't know," Amber stammered, peering through the grimy window. "Oh my God, they're coming in." Heavy running footsteps pounded up the stairs, followed by a thunderous knock that shook the entire apartment. "Paramedics! Police! Open the door!" Before they could react, the flimsy door burst open and the tiny room was flooded with uniformed professionals. A paramedic rushed to Helen's side, checking her pulse and pupils. "Ma'am, can you hear me? What did you take?" Helen, caught completely off guard, could only stammer, I. Amber, thinking fast, grabbed the empty vitamin bottle and handed it to a second paramedic. He glanced at it, read the label, and then looked at his partner with an expression of profound disbelief. "It's Women's 50+ Complete Multivitamin," he announced to the room. The tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by an almost comical awkwardness. The police officer, who had been preparing for a tragedy, slowly put his notepad away. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, were now crowded in the hallway, peeking in. "Ma'am," the lead paramedic said, his voice laced with professional restraint, "you seem to be in perfect health. Ingesting this many vitamins at once isn't a good idea for your kidneys, but it's not going to kill you. We can take you to the hospital to get checked out if you'd like. Helen's face burned a shade of crimson that clashed horribly with her dress. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. The public humiliation was 1,000 times worse than anything Sarah had done to her. As the paramedics were helping a mortified Helen to her feet, Sarah's text message arrived on Tyler's phone. He read it, his face turning ashen. Called 911 for you. Hope mom is okay. Tell her to drink plenty of water. I read that high doses of vitamin B are actually great for your skin. You can pay the ambulance bill online. Their grand tragic performance had ended in a humiliating farce, broadcast to the entire apartment complex. But as the last of the emergency responders left, a new, far more menacing sound replaced the sirens. A heavy, insistent pounding began on their newly broken door. This time it wasn't the police. Amber! A rough voice snarled from the hallway. We know you're in there. The boss's patience has run out. Open this door or we're taking it off its hinges. The fake crisis was over, the real one had just arrived. The loan shark's visit left a scar on the apartment that no amount of scrubbing could remove. It wasn't just the lingering stench of cheap cologne and menace, it was the suffocating presence of real, imminent danger. The family was trapped. Amber, the architect of their ruin, knew her time was running out. Her usual tactics of tears and manipulation were useless against men who communicated with threats and violence. She needed an exit strategy, and she needed it now. That night, under the flickering light of a single bare bulb, she gathered the broken pieces of her puppet family. This is all Sarah's fault, she began, her voice a low, urgent hiss. The lie was absurd, but it was the only tune they knew how to dance to. If she hadn't thrown us out, they never would have found us. She pushed us into this corner. Helen, her face a haggard mess of tear tracks and grime, nodded numbly. That devil woman. There is only one way out, Amber continued, her eyes gleaming with a feral, desperate light. We have to get back in that house. Not to live there to get what's ours. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. The deed. The original deed to the house. If we have that, we can use it as collateral. We can get a loan from a private lender, pay these guys off, and have enough left over to disappear and start fresh somewhere else. It was a bank robbery plan for people too stupid to rob a bank. It was illegal, reckless, and deeply flawed. But to the terrified, desperate people in that room it sounded like a lifeline. How do we get back in? Kevin mumbled from the sofa, his voice raspy. She'll never let us in the door. That's where you come in, Amber said, turning her focus to Helen and Kevin. You two are going to give the performance of your lives. You're going to her, and you're going to beg. You will cry. You will grovel. You will tell her you were wrong, that you've learned your lesson, that you have nowhere else to go. You will appeal to whatever shred of pity she has left. You just need her to open the door, and let you in just for a night or two. Once we're inside, Tyler and I will find the deed. She probably keeps it in a safe in the master bedroom. We'll get it and we'll be gone before she even knows what happened. Meanwhile, Sarah was taking control. The fake suicide attempt had been a clumsy, pathetic ploy, but it had crossed a new line. It proved to her that their desperation made them unpredictable and potentially dangerous. She needed to understand the full scope of the problem she was dealing with. She needed to know who Amber Scott really was. The next morning, she made a call to a discreet private investigator, a former police detective whose firm was known for its thoroughness. I want you to find out everything you can about a woman named Amber Scott, Sarah instructed, her voice crisp and businesslike. I need a full background check. Past addresses, marital status, criminal record, financial history, everything. I have a feeling she's not who she says she is. It took the investigator less than a week. The file he delivered to Sarah's office was thicker than she had expected. She sat at her desk after hours, the city lights twinkling outside her window, and read. The truth was worse than anything she had imagined. Amber Scott's real name was Crystal Stevens. She was indeed from a poor town, but not in the way she'd claimed. She was married with a 3-year-old son. The report included a heartbreaking photo of a tired-looking young man holding a small boy, her real family. She had abandoned them a year ago, leaving behind a mountain of debt from gambling and pyramid schemes. The PI's report contained copies of police reports from 2 other counties where families had accused her of the same scam: faking a pregnancy, manipulating them into selling assets, and disappearing with the money. She wasn't a victim, she was a predator. Sarah closed the folder, a cold, hard knot forming in her stomach. She felt a flicker of pity for the child in the photo, but for the woman who had brought so much chaos into her life, she felt nothing but contempt. Now she understood. The loan sharks weren't just after a few thousand, they were after Crystal's massive, long-standing debts. And her family-in-law were not just accomplices, they were her next intended victims. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Kevin. "Can we please meet? Mom and I are desperate. We have nowhere to go. Please, Sarah." The trap was being set, but now she would be the one to spring it. She met them at a public park, a neutral ground. Kevin and Helen looked the part, their clothes rumpled, their faces etched with what looked like genuine despair. They delivered their lines perfectly, crying, begging, and apologizing for everything. Sarah listened patiently, her expression carefully neutral. She let them finish, then sighed, a calculated performance of weary resignation. I don't know," she said, letting a note of hesitation creep into her voice. "After everything that's happened." "We'll do anything, Sarah," Helen sobbed, grabbing her hand. "We'll be your servants. Just let us come home." "All right," Sarah said finally, as if their pleas had worn her down. "We can't decide this here. Let's have a proper dinner tomorrow night at the Oyster Bank downtown. We'll talk everything over then." As a family, they practically wept with relief, convinced they had succeeded. As they walked away, already whispering excitedly to each other, Sarah watched them go. She felt no pity, no anger. She felt only the cold, clear focus of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. That night, she didn't clean or organize. She sat in her quiet living room, the private investigator's folder open on the coffee table. She studied the faces in the photographs, the cold facts of Crystal's cruel deceptions. Tomorrow night, at a table surrounded by people enjoying a fine meal, she would serve Helen, Kevin, and Tyler their last supper, and for dessert, she would serve them the truth. The Oyster Bank was a world away from the greasy takeout and stale coffee that had become the family's daily reality. It was a place of soft lighting, clinking glasses, and the hushed, confident murmur of Charlotte's elite. Helen, Kevin, and Tyler arrived overdressed and overeager, a trio of imposters trying to blend in. Helen had squeezed into a tight leopard print dress, her face plastered with a thick layer of foundation. Tyler wore a cheap, shiny shirt and Kevin had slicked his hair back, a desperate attempt to recapture a sense of the man he used to be. Amber, now Crystal in Sarah's mind, was the most convincing. Dressed in a tasteful maternity dress, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, the picture of serene motherhood. They walked in with the swagger of victors, convinced this dinner was a surrender ceremony. Sarah was already seated at a secluded corner booth. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, her posture poised, her presence a quiet island of calm in their sea of chaotic energy. She offered them a small, unreadable smile as they slid into the booth around her. "You look wonderful, Sarah," Helen gushed, her voice oozing a false sweetness that made Sarah's skin crawl. "So good to see you looking relaxed. It's been so stressful for all of us." The meal was a surreal performance. The family ordered the most expensive items on the menu: lobster, oysters, filet mignon. They ate with a ravenous hunger that spoke of weeks of cheap ramen noodles. Between mouthfuls, they laid out their future plans, thinly veiled demands disguised as wistful hopes. "It will be so good to be home," Helen sighed, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "Amber needs a proper nursery, of course. We'll have to clear out that little office of yours, Sarah. And I'll finally have my workshop back," Tyler added, gesturing with a lobster claw. "I've got big plans, big ideas." Sarah said little, merely nodding and sipping her wine, her eyes moving from one face to the next. She watched Crystal gently patting her belly, a gesture of pure, calculated fraud. She watched Helen practically vibrating with greed. She watched Tyler, a fool, basking in a dream that was about to become a nightmare. They were so busy planning the division of the spoils that they never once looked at the executioner sitting at their table. When the waiter cleared the last of the dessert plates, Sarah placed her wine glass down with a quiet finality. The soft click silenced their chatter. "Well," she said, her voice even and calm, "that was a lovely meal. Now let's get down to business." Helen beamed. "Yes, let's talk about the moving arrangements." "Not exactly," Sarah said. She reached for her handbag and pulled out a thick blue file folder. She didn't open it, she simply slid it across the polished table until it stopped directly in front of Tyler. "I believe this belongs to you," she said. "Or rather, it's about the person you think you're starting a family with." A flicker of confusion crossed Tyler's face. Crystal went rigid, her fork clattering onto her plate. She reached for the folder, but Tyler was faster. He opened it. The first thing he saw was a photograph. It was a cheap sun-bleached snapshot of Crystal looking younger and happier, holding the hand of a small dark-haired boy. Standing beside her with his arm around her waist was a man Tyler had never seen before. On the back of the photo, a child's crayon scrawl read, "Mommy, Daddy, and me." "What is this?" Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. "Keep reading," Sarah said softly. He turned the page. It was a copy of a marriage certificate from a small town in South Carolina, legally binding Crystal and Stevens to a Mr. Leo Martinez. The next page was a copy of their son's birth certificate. Then came the police reports from other counties, the signed affidavits from other families, other victims detailing the exact same pregnancy scam. And finally, tucked at the back was a printout of Crystal's extensive online gambling history, showing debts that ran into the tens of thousands. The color drained from Tyler's face. He looked up at Crystal, his eyes wide with a horrified, dawning comprehension. Helen and Kevin, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, leaned over to see. Helen let out a choked gasp as she saw the marriage certificate. "Married?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You have a child?" Crystal sat frozen for a second, her mind racing for an escape route, for one last lie. But there was none. Sarah's evidence was absolute, a steel cage slamming shut around her. "My money!" Helen suddenly wailed, the real terror hitting her. "The money from the land. You told me it was for the lawyer, for the investment. Where is my money, you little?" That's when the civility shattered. Tyler, with a guttural roar of pure rage and humiliation, lunged across the table at Crystal. "You lied to me!" he screamed, knocking over glasses as he tried to grab her. "You made me a joke." The restaurant staff rushed over, trying to separate them. Patrons at other tables were on their feet, their phones out, recording the shocking spectacle. And in the middle of the chaos, Crystal transformed. The soft, victimized Amber persona dissolved, and the hard, cold con artist beneath was revealed. She shoved Tyler back with surprising strength, a venomous sneer twisting her face. "Get your hands off me, you useless oaf," she spat, her voice coarse and stripped of all its former sweetness. She stood up, brushing down her dress as if shaking off dirt. She looked at the horrified faces of Helen and her sons, and let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You really thought I'd want to be part of this pathetic family?" she sneered. "My God, you people are the stupidest marks I've ever seen. A greedy old hag, a spineless drunk, and a brain-dead man-child. It was like taking candy from a baby." She looked directly at Helen. "And your money? It's gone. I paid off a debt, bought some nice things. You'll never see a dime of it. Consider it a fee for your education." She turned to leave, but paused to deliver one final devastating blow. She looked down at her fake baby bump, patted it, and then looked at Tyler with utter contempt. "And this? Don't worry, you're not the father. I wouldn't let a degenerate like you father a goldfish." With that, she turned on her heel and strode out of the restaurant, leaving a mushroom cloud of devastation in her wake. Helen was sobbing hysterically into her hands. Tyler stood panting, held back by a waiter, his face a mask of impotent fury. Kevin just sat there, staring into space, completely catatonic. Sarah watched them for a moment, the architects of her pain now drowning in their own. She felt nothing, no pity, no triumph, just a quiet, clean emptiness. She calmly took a few $100 from her purse and placed them on the table to cover the meal and the damages. Then she stood up, smoothed down her dress, and walked away, not looking back, leaving them to pay the true cost of the evening all by themselves. The aftermath of the restaurant explosion was a slow, agonizing decay. Crystal was a ghost, vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Her phone number was disconnected, her social media profiles deleted. But the wreckage she left behind was all too real. The loan sharks, deprived of their primary target, turned their undivided and brutal attention to the next name on the dotted line, Tyler Miller. They didn't bother with threats anymore. 2 days after the dinner, they simply kicked in the flimsy apartment door and dragged Tyler out into the hallway. While one held him against the wall, the other calmly unfolded a document he'd signed weeks ago in a haze of infatuation, a personal guarantee for one of Crystal's high-interest loans. "The lady's gone," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "That makes you the man of the hour, kid. The boss wants his money. $10,000. You've got 1 week or that pretty face of yours is going to get a whole lot less pretty." Panic, cold and absolute, seized Tyler. He had never worked a real job in his life. $10,000 might as well have been $10 million. The family had nothing left. The money from the land was gone. Their only remaining asset was Kevin's beat-up pickup truck, which wouldn't fetch a tenth of what he owed. Days bled into a sleepless, terrified blur. Tyler didn't leave the apartment, jumping at every sound from the hallway. It was during this desperate haze that a call came from an old acquaintance, a guy named Ricky from the periphery of his former life of bars and bad decisions. "Heard you're in a jam," Ricky said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "I might have a one-night gig for you. Quick cash, easy work. All you got to do is drive." "Drive what?" Tyler asked, his heart pounding. "Just a little holiday cheer," Ricky chuckled. 4th of July is coming up. Demand is high. Pick up a truck in South Carolina. Drive it back to a warehouse in Charlotte. $5,000. Cash in your hand the moment you drop the keys. Tyler knew exactly what holiday cheer meant. Illegal fireworks, the kind that could take your hand off. It was a felony. But then he pictured the loan shark's dead eyes and felt the phantom pressure of a fist against his jaw. Prison seemed a distant, abstract threat compared to the very real, very immediate one he was facing. "I'm in," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The night of the job was dark and moonless. The pickup location was a deserted farm road just over the state line. The truck they gave him was old and smelled of rust and gasoline. The cargo bed was loaded with heavy, unmarked cardboard boxes. Driving back on the dark highway, every pair of headlights in his rearview mirror felt like the police. His hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. He was almost back, just a few miles from the warehouse, when the night was suddenly torn apart by flashing blue and red lights. A police cruiser appeared out of nowhere, pulling alongside him, its siren screaming to life. A sting. He'd driven straight into a multi-agency sting operation targeting illegal fireworks smuggling. He was pulled from the truck and pushed against its side, the cold metal of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. As they read him his rights, all he could think was that the cuffs felt heavy and real, not like in the movies. This was the end of his life as he knew it. The news of Tyler's arrest was the final blow that shattered Helen's already broken spirit. It wasn't just a misdemeanor this time, this was a serious crime. Her baby boy, the one she had sacrificed everything for, was now a convicted felon facing years in prison. She looked around the trashy apartment at Kevin, who sat staring blankly at the wall, and she knew there was only one person left in the world who could possibly help. She found Sarah as she was leaving work, walking to her car in the evening light. Helen didn't stage a scene this time, she was too broken for theatrics. She simply stood in Sarah's path, a frail, hunched figure, her face a gray mask of grief. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice raw and cracking. "They took my boy. They took Tyler." Sarah stopped, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, just waited. "He made a mistake. A terrible mistake," Helen pleaded, tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. "He was scared. Those men, they were threatening him. He needs a lawyer, a good one. They're asking for thousands for bail. I have nothing left, Sarah. Nothing. Please," she begged, her body trembling. "He's my son. He's all I have left. Please help him." Sarah looked at the woman who had tried to destroy her, now completely undone by the consequences of her own making. There was no anger left in Sarah's heart, no desire for revenge, there was only a vast, empty landscape of pity. "I am sorry for what happened to Tyler, Helen," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I will not give you money for his legal defense. He broke the law. He has to face the consequences of his actions." Giving him a high-priced lawyer to try and get him out of it won't teach him anything. It will only continue the cycle that you started. Helen let out a gut-wrenching sob, crumpling in on herself. But he's my baby. I know, Sarah said softly. She opened her purse and took out her wallet. She pulled out all the cash she had, 5 $100 bills. She held it out to Helen. This is not for a lawyer, she said, her voice clear and absolute. This is for you, for food, for a bus ticket, for whatever you need to get through the next few days. It's the last thing I will ever give you. After this, you and I are finished. You will not contact me again. You will not come to my home or my work. This is the end. Helen stared at the money, then at Sarah's face. She saw no hatred there. But she also saw no weakness. She saw only an unbreakable boundary, a line drawn in concrete. With a trembling hand, she took the bills. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. Sarah nodded once, a gesture of finality. She turned and walked to her car, got in, and drove away without looking back. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Helen standing alone in the vast, empty parking lot, clutching a handful of money that could solve nothing. A tragic monument to a life laid to waste by greed and hate. The book was closed. The story was over. And Sarah was finally truly free. Months later, spring arrived in Charlotte, painting the city in vibrant strokes of dogwood pink and azalea red. It was a season of renewal, and in no place was that more true than inside the quiet, sunlit rooms of 5812 Maple Creek Lane. The house had become more than a home. It was Sarah's sanctuary, a fortress of peace she had reclaimed and rebuilt brick by brick. Her life had settled into a new, powerful rhythm. The promotion to regional director was official, and she thrived under the increased responsibility. Her confidence and competence earned her the unwavering respect of her colleagues. The whispers and rumors were a distant, laughable memory. At work, she was a leader. At home, she was simply content. She spent her weekends gardening, her hands in the rich soil, coaxing life from the earth. She hosted small, cheerful dinner parties for her close friends, their laughter filling the rooms that had once echoed with venom and greed. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a living, breathing extension of her own hard-won serenity. One Saturday afternoon, as she was relaxing on her balcony with a book and a glass of iced tea, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, her guard went up, a reflexive response from a past life. Then, with a quiet sigh, she opened it. Sarah, it's Kevin. I got your number from an old friend. Hope this is okay. I know I shouldn't bother you, but I wanted to tell you something. I'm getting married next month. Sarah's breath caught for a second, not in pain but in surprise. She kept reading. Her name is Brenda. We met out here in a little town near the mountains. She's a good woman, quiet. She knows about my past mistakes. We're buying a small piece of land, going to try and build something. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything and thank you. You showed me what a strong person looks like. I hope you're happy. Please don't feel like you have to reply. She read the message twice. She searched her heart for any lingering trace of anger, jealousy, or regret. She found nothing. There was only a profound and final sense of release, like the last knot in a tangled rope finally coming undone. Kevin had found his place, a life that suited his scale, far from the city and the ambitions he could never match. His apology was clumsy and years too late, but it was closure nonetheless. With steady fingers, she typed a brief reply. Congratulations, Kevin. I wish you both a happy life. She hit send. Then she opened his contact info, pressed block this caller, and confirmed without a moment's hesitation. It was not an act of malice, but an act of housekeeping, of sweeping away the very last speck of dust from her past. She thought, for a fleeting moment, of the rest of them. She'd heard through the grapevine that Tyler had taken a plea bargain and was serving a minimum sentence in a state facility. Helen, after her son's conviction, had quietly moved away to live with a distant cousin, a diminished and forgotten woman. They were ghosts, characters in a story that was no longer hers to read. That evening, Sarah stood on her balcony, looking out as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of jasmine from the garden below. She held a glass of wine, the crystal cool against her fingers. The city lights began to twinkle on, a diamond blanket spread out before her. She was 32 years old. She was successful, she was independent, and she was at peace. The lock on her front gate, a state-of-the-art security system she could control with a tap on her phone, was no longer a source of anxiety. It was a symbol of her sovereignty. This house, this life was entirely hers, built not just with her inheritance, but with her courage, her resilience, and her unwavering belief in her own worth. The past was a landscape of ashes, but from those ashes she had built an empire of one. She raised her glass to the twilight, to the quiet strength of her own heart, and to the beautiful wide-open future that was waiting.